Antarctica was a place of endless ice and silence. The bottom of the world where secrets could stay buried forever. Dr. Adam Kessler stared out of the plane's tiny window as the barren, white landscape stretched endlessly below. He had been here before, chasing rumors of secret Cold War experiments, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't chasing a rumor, he was following a map. The map had arrived in a plain envelope, no return address. It was a satellite image, grainy and old, showing what appeared to be a structure deep within the Queen Maud land region of Antarctica. Scrawled in the corner was a cryptic note. They've been hiding this for decades. Kessler had spent weeks planning the expedition, pulling every string he had left to assemble a small team. His only companions were Ben Carter, a hardened survivalist and guide who had braved Antarctica's extremes for over a decade, and Dr. Elias Novak, a geophysicist whose curiosity about unexplored anomalies matched Kessler's desperation for answers. As the plane descended to their drop-off point, the pilot turned in his seat, his expression grave. "This is as far as I go," he said. "Whatever you're looking for out there, I hope it's worth it." The three men disembarked into the howling wind. The air was a brutal assault, each breath a sharp sting against their lungs. Carter unloaded their gear, sleds packed with tents, supplies, and an array of cameras and sensors. Novak activated his GPS, orienting them toward their target, a distant anomaly buried under miles of ice. As they began their trek, the reality of the journey set in. The Antarctic wilderness was merciless, a land where the cold itself could kill you. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying with it a low, almost mechanical hum that set Kessler's teeth on edge. By nightfall, they had set up camp, their tents illuminated by the dim glow of their headlamps. As Kessler reviewed his notes, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Outside, the wind seemed to whisper, carrying faint sounds that didn't belong, clicks, hums, and something that almost sounded like breathing. "Just the wind," Carter grunted when Kessler mentioned it. But Kessler wasn't so sure. He'd spent years chasing shadows, and this felt different. The next day's march brought them closer to the coordinates on the map. The terrain grew stranger with each mile, the ice forming jagged spires that seemed almost sculpted. Novak stopped frequently to take readings, frowning at his instruments. "Something's not right," he said. "The electromagnetic field here is abnormal. It's like there's something under the ice." "What kind of something?" Kessler pressed. Novak shrugged, his breath fogging the air. "Could be a natural anomaly, could be artificial. Whatever it is, it's big." By midday, they reached the coordinates. At first, there was nothing, just an endless expanse of ice. Then Carter shouted, pointing to a faint outline in the distance. As they approached, the outline resolved into something unmistakable, a structure partially buried in the ice. It was massive, its edges sharp and geometric. The surface was black and smooth, contrasting starkly with the white ice surrounding it. Novak ran his hand over the material, his brow furrowed. "This isn't natural," he said. "It's not even metal. I've never seen anything like it." Kessler's camera whirred as he filmed the discovery. "What are we looking at?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. Novak didn't answer. He was too focused on a seam in the structure, a faint outline of a door. Carter joined him, using a thermal cutter to melt through the ice that had sealed it shut. As the door creaked open, a blast of warm air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that made Kessler gag, chemical, metallic, and faintly sweet. "Air's warm," Carter said, his voice tense. "That's not right. This place should be frozen solid." They stepped inside, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. The walls were smooth and featureless, the floor covered in a thin layer of frost. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its silence broken only by the faint hum of unseen machinery. "This isn't just a structure," Novak said, his voice low. "It's operational." Kessler felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Operational for what? The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its smooth, icy walls gleaming faintly under the harsh light of the team's headlamps. The air inside was unnaturally warm, a stark contrast to the bone-chilling cold outside. Dr. Adam Kessler felt the warmth seep through his gloves as he ran his hand along the wall. It was too smooth, too precise. This wasn't natural, nor was it ancient. This place was meticulously engineered. "This isn't just a structure," Novak murmured, his scanner whirring softly in his hands. "This is alive with power. Whatever's running this facility, it's still active." Carter gripped his weapon tightly, his sharp eyes darting to every shadow. The corridor was eerily silent, save for the faint, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "This place feels wrong," he muttered, "like it's watching us." The trio moved cautiously, their boots crunching softly against the frost-covered floor. The further they ventured, the more unsettling the environment became. Strange symbols began to appear on the walls, angular, alien-looking glyphs that pulsed faintly in rhythm with the hum. Kessler's camera whirred as he captured the details, the symbols casting eerie, shifting patterns across the screen. "Look at this," Novak said, stopping in his tracks. He pointed to a segment of the wall where the glyphs were clustered around a panel. It was rectangular, metallic, and bore a faint insignia that made Kessler's stomach drop. NASA, Classified Division. "NASA?" Carter asked, incredulous. "What the hell is NASA doing all the way out here?" Kessler stepped closer, his breath fogging the air. "This isn't just a forgotten outpost," he said quietly. "This is something they didn't want anyone to find." As if on cue, the corridor widened into a massive chamber. The walls soared upward, vanishing into darkness, and the floor was lined with rows of machinery. Large cylindrical tanks stood in the center of the room, each one encased in frost. Pipes snaked from the ceiling and floor, pumping a viscous green fluid that glowed faintly. The hum grew louder as they entered, resonating in their chests. Kessler's camera panned across the room, capturing the disturbing symmetry of the machinery. "This is a factory," he whispered. "But for what?" Novak approached one of the tanks, his gloved hand wiping away the frost that obscured its surface. As the glass cleared, he stumbled back, his face pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. Inside the tank was a human figure, suspended in the green liquid. The man's eyes were closed, his skin pale and wrinkled, as though he had been submerged for decades. Tubes protruded from his nose and mouth, and faint bubbles rose from his chest. Kessler stepped closer, his stomach turning as he realized the man wasn't alone. Dozens of tanks lined the room, each containing a similar figure. Some were alive, their faint movements barely perceptible, but others were unmistakably dead, their bodies bloated, their skin sloughing off into the liquid. "This isn't just a factory," Novak said, his voice trembling. This is human experimentation." The trio stood frozen before the rows of cryosleep pods, their headlamps casting harsh beams of light on the frosted glass surfaces. The sheer number of pods stretched beyond what the dim chamber could illuminate, fading into the cold metallic darkness at the edges of the room. The hum of machinery was omnipresent, a low, bone-deep vibration that made Kessler's stomach churn. Dr. Novak approached the nearest pod, his breath fogging the icy glass as he leaned closer. "They're humans," he said, his voice trembling. "Oh my God, they're alive." Kessler stepped up beside him, his camera trained on the pod. His trembling hands filmed the scene as Novak wiped away the frost with a gloved hand. The face of a man emerged from the frozen haze, his features eerily peaceful. His skin was pale, stretched taut over his cheekbones, and tubes snaked into his mouth and nose, disappearing into the glowing green fluid that surrounded him. "He's breathing," Novak whispered. "Barely, but he's alive." "Alive?" Carter's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This guy looks like he's been in there for decades. How is that even possible?" Novak's scanner beeped as he took a reading of the pod. "Cryostasis," he said, "but it's like nothing I've ever seen. This isn't theoretical anymore. They've perfected it." Kessler moved to the next pod, his heart pounding as he wiped away the frost. This time, the face staring back at him wasn't peaceful. It was grotesque. The man's eyes were open, clouded and unseeing, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. His skin was cracked, blackened in places, and his body was contorted as though he had fought desperately before succumbing to the icy embrace. Not all of them survived, Kessler said, his voice hollow. He filmed the horrific sight, his lens capturing every gruesome detail. Carter approached a third pod, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He hesitated before clearing the frost, his expression hardening as he saw the figure inside. This one's a woman, military, judging by the insignia on her suit. He pointed to a faint patch on her sleeve, just visible beneath the fluid. She's got rank. What the hell was she doing here? They're not volunteers, Novak said, his tone dark. These people didn't sign up for this. Kessler's mind raced as he scanned the rows of pods, each one containing a human subject in varying states of preservation. Some were pristine, their bodies preserved in eerie perfection. Others were bloated, decayed, their features barely recognizable. This is inhuman, Kessler muttered. They're using these people as lab rats. Novak moved to the control panel at the base of the nearest pod. The screen flickered to life, displaying rows of data. Subject ID 1437. Status active. Cryosleep duration 25 years. Beneath it were chilling details. Experiment. Long-term stasis, durability. These aren't tests, Novak said, his voice shaking. These are evaluations. They're seeing how long the human body can survive in cryosleep, and they're not stopping. Carter's face darkened. What kind of sick bastards do this? Novak tapped through the interface, pulling up more data. The list of subjects scrolled endlessly, each entry marked with cold, clinical precision. Active, terminated, awaiting processing. Kessler leaned in, his voice tense. What does awaiting processing mean? Novak hesitated, his hands trembling. I don't know, but I think it means there are more. He pointed toward a darkened corner of the chamber. The group approached cautiously, their headlamps illuminating another set of pods, smaller and more compact. These were empty, their glass lids open and frosted over. Beside them were rows of metallic gurneys, each one stained with dark, rust-colored streaks. Carter examined one of the gurneys, his face tightening. This isn't just cryosleep, he said. It's processing. They're cycling people through. Some make it to the pods. The rest... He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Novak's scanner beeped again, and he turned toward a nearby console. The screen flickered, displaying a crude map of the facility. Red dots blinked across the diagram, clustered in one section labeled Processing Center. This is only one part of the facility, Novak said grimly. There's more, much more. Suddenly, a deep, mechanical groan echoed through the chamber, and the lights flickered. The glyphs on the walls flared brighter, their pulsating rhythm intensifying. Kessler felt his stomach lurch as the pods around them began to hiss and hum. What's happening? Carter demanded, raising his weapon. Novak frantically scanned the controls. The system's activating, he said. Something triggered it. The pods began to glow brighter, the green fluid inside bubbling and swirling. Frost melted from the glass, revealing the horrific details of the occupants. The dead ones appeared to dissolve, their bodies breaking apart into a thick, viscous sludge. The living began to twitch, their eyes fluttering open in silent terror. They're waking up, Novak whispered, his voice filled with dread. Kessler took a step back, his camera still recording. The pod nearest him hissed violently, its lids sliding open with a loud, mechanical screech. The occupant, a man with half his face frostbitten, lurched forward, tubes ripping from his body as he convulsed violently. Carter raised his rifle. "They're not alive anymore," he shouted, firing into the pod. The man's body spasmed, but it didn't fall. Instead, it twisted unnaturally, its movements jerky and inhuman. "We have to go," Kessler yelled, grabbing Novak's arm. "Now!" The chamber erupted into chaos as more pods began to open, releasing their occupants. Half-dead, frost-ravaged figures that stumbled forward with grotesque, unnatural movements. The air filled with a cacophony of hisses, groans, and the mechanical whir of the machinery coming fully online. The trio bolted from the chamber, their footsteps echoing loudly as they retraced their path through the corridors. The lights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The hum of the machinery grew louder, accompanied by a new sound, a faint, metallic hiss. "What's that?" Carter asked, his voice tight. Kessler's stomach churned as they turned a corner and saw them, humanoid figures emerging from hidden panels in the walls. Their movements were stiff, jerky, and wrong. Their faces were pale and expressionless, covered by masks connected to tubes that pulsed with the same green fluid. "They're not alive," Novak whispered, his scanner trembling in his hands. They're puppets." The figures moved toward them with unsettling precision, their blank eyes locked on the intruders. Carter fired his weapon, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck one of the figures, but it didn't stop. Instead, it twitched violently, then resumed its approach. "Run!" Kessler shouted. They fled deeper into the facility, the sound of the figures' hissing breaths close behind. Kessler's heart pounded as they entered another chamber, this one even larger than the last. The walls were lined with pods, and in the center was a massive cylindrical device, its surface covered in glowing glyphs. Novak stared at it in horror. "This is the core," he said. "It's controlling everything. The pods, the tanks, the puppets." "What happens if we shut it down?" Kessler asked, his voice desperate. Novak hesitated. "It might stop them, or it might bring the whole facility down on our heads." Kessler turned to Carter, who nodded grimly. "Do it," Carter said. "Better to die trying than end up in one of those pods." Novak moved to the console, his fingers trembling as he navigated the alien interface. The glyphs on the device began to pulse faster, the hum rising to an ear-splitting crescendo. Suddenly, the reanimated figures burst into the room. Carter fired again, but they kept coming, their blank eyes unyielding. Kessler grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it at the nearest figure, the impact sending a sickening crack through the air. Novak pressed a final sequence on the console, and the device emitted a deafening roar. The lights flickered violently, and the figures froze in place. For a moment, it seemed as though they had succeeded. Then the doors slammed shut, and the walls began to close in. The doors slammed shut with a metallic clang, and the temperature in the chamber began to plummet. Frost formed rapidly on the walls and floors, and Kessler could feel the bitter cold biting through his insulated gear. The reanimated figures froze in place. Their blank eyes locked on the trio, but the relief was short-lived. The hum of the central device deepened, a mechanical groan that seemed to come from the very core of the facility. Novak turned from the console, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I triggered something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's resetting. The entire system is rebooting." "Rebooting for what?" Carter demanded, his rifle still trained on the inert figures. Novak's eyes darted to the pods lining the walls. The frost-covered glass began to clear, revealing the grotesque occupants inside. Some were emaciated to the point of skeletonization, their bodies contorted in agony. Others appeared eerily peaceful, their faces serene as if they were merely sleeping. But the machinery around them told a different story. Tubes pumped the glowing green fluid into their veins, and electrodes embedded in their skulls emitted faint sparks. "It's resetting to continue the experiments," Novak whispered. "The cryosleep trials. They're automated. We've only paused them." The lights flickered, and the reanimated figures twitched, their joints creaking as they slowly came back to life. Their movements were more fluid now, deliberate and menacing. One stepped forward, its blank mask splitting open to reveal a twisted amalgamation of flesh and machinery beneath. A human face fused with tubes and metal, its mouth permanently agape in a silent scream. Kessler gripped Novak's shoulder. "How do we stop this?" he demanded. "We can't," Novak replied, his voice breaking. "This place was designed to run autonomously. Even if we destroy the core, there's no guarantee it'll shut down for good." Carter fired a shot at the nearest figure, the bullet punching through its head. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it lunged forward, its claw-like hands outstretched. Carter sidestepped, smashing the butt of his rifle into its head, but two more figures emerged from the shadows. "They're waking up!" Carter shouted. "We have to move." The three men bolted for the nearest exit, but the doors were sealed tight, their reinforced frames glowing faintly with the same alien glyphs that adorned the core. The temperature continued to drop, their breaths forming thick clouds of vapor as they struggled to find another way out. "This isn't just an experiment," Kessler said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "This is a prison. They didn't just trap those people, they've trapped us." Novak scanned the room frantically, his trembling hands barely able to hold his device. "There's got to be an override," he said. "A way to open the doors. Give me a second." "You don't have a second," Carter snapped, firing at another advancing figure. The creature's body convulsed as the bullets tore through its chest, but it kept coming. Its lifeless eyes locked on him. Novak darted back to the console, his fingers flying over the alien interface. Come on," he muttered. The glyphs on the core flared brighter, and a deep, monotone voice filled the chamber, speaking in a language none of them could understand. Kessler's blood ran cold as he realized the voice wasn't human. It was the facility itself responding to their intrusion. Novak froze, his face a mask of terror. "It's not just shutting us in," he said. "It's categorizing us." "What the hell does that mean?" Kessler demanded. "It means," Novak replied, his voice hollow, "we're the next subjects." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Carter grabbed Kessler's arm. "We can't stay here. We need to find another way out." Before they could move, the reanimated figures surged forward, their movements faster and more coordinated. One grabbed Novak, its clawed hand digging into his shoulder as it dragged him toward an empty pod. "Help me!" Novak screamed, his voice echoing through the chamber. Kessler lunged forward, trying to pull Novak free, but the creature was too strong. It forced Novak into the pod, the glass lid hissing shut as the machinery roared to life. Green fluid began to fill the chamber, muffling Novak's frantic screams as he pounded on the glass. "No!" Kessler shouted, his fists slamming against the pod. "Let him go!" But it was too late. The pod's glyphs glowed brightly, and Novak's body went still as the cryosleep process began. Kessler and Carter staggered back, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The reanimated figures turned toward them, their movements almost mechanical as they advanced. Carter fired again, but his rifle clicked empty. "This is it," Carter said, his voice grim. "We're not getting out of here." Kessler shook his head, refusing to accept it. "There has to be a way." Before he could finish, the creatures surrounded them. Two grabbed Carter, their clawed hands pinning him down as he struggled violently. "Run!" he shouted to Kessler. "Go!" "I can't!" Kessler screamed, his voice raw with panic. The clawed hands jerked him forward, his boots scraping uselessly against the floor. His camera dangled from his neck, bouncing against his chest with every futile thrash, capturing distorted footage of his impending fate. The pod hissed as it fully opened, releasing a wave of freezing mist that rolled across the floor. The inside was lined with a smooth, rubbery material, eerily organic against the harsh mechanical backdrop. The green fluid began to churn, small bubbles rising to the surface as the machinery prepared for its next subject. "No, you can't do this!" Kessler shouted, his voice breaking. He twisted again, his shoulder burning with the effort, but the creature's grip didn't loosen. Its blank, mask-covered face betrayed no emotion, no recognition of his humanity. To it, he was just another component, a piece of biological material to be processed. The pod's base emitted a low beep, and a set of mechanical arms unfolded from its sides. They were precise, almost surgical, their claw-like pincers twitching in anticipation. The creature holding Kessler adjusted its grip, lifting him slightly before unceremoniously shoving him backward into the pod. Kessler hit the back of the pod with a thud, the cold, rubbery surface pressing against his spine. He kicked out wildly, his boots connecting with the pod's edges, but the glass lid began to descend. "No, no, please!" he screamed, his fists pounding against the thick glass. His breath fogged it instantly, his reflection distorted by the frosted edges. The green fluid began to rise from the base, its thick, viscous texture clinging to his legs as it climbed. It was colder than anything he'd ever felt, the chill slicing through his insulated suit and searing his skin. He tried to lift his legs to keep them out of the liquid, but the mechanical arms pinned his shoulders and chest, locking him in place. "Let me out! Somebody, help me!" His screams echoed back at him, muffled by the glass and the cold, sterile hum of the machinery. The fluid reached his waist now, its unnatural glow casting sickly green light across his face. His hands slapped against the glass, his palms raw and stinging. In the corner of his vision, Kessler saw Carter's pod closing. The man's eyes were wide with terror, his face contorted as he struggled against the same fate. "Kessler!" he shouted, his voice barely audible through the layers of glass and liquid. The cry was cut off as the fluid engulfed Carter's head, his body going still as the pod sealed completely. "No! No, damn it!" Kessler roared, his voice breaking into sobs. The fluid was at his chest now, its frigid touch numbing his limbs. His fingers curled into fists, pounding uselessly against the glass. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to resist, but the fluid was relentless, rising inexorably toward his face. The mechanical arms descended again, their pincers extending toward his head. Kessler flinched, trying to twist away, but they locked onto either side of his skull. A thin needle emerged from the arm nearest his temple, glinting in the green light. He thrashed violently, his head shaking as much as the clamps allowed, but the needle pierced his skin with surgical precision. An explosion of white-hot pain lanced through his head, followed by a deep, numbing cold that seeped into his brain. His vision blurred and the world seemed to tilt. The green fluid reached his neck, and his panicked breath sent bubbles rising to the surface. "I don't want to die," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The last thing he saw was the pod's display flickering to life, its glyphs pulsing softly. The text scrolled across the screen. New subject intake complete. Status: cryosleep initiated. The fluid swallowed him completely and the world went dark. The pod hissed as it sealed, locking Kessler away in a frozen limbo. Outside, the reanimated figures returned to their stations, the facility settling into silence once more. Above ground, the Antarctic winds howled, burying the factory under another layer of ice. Its horrors remained hidden, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon them.